We're considering today Exodus chapter 23 verses 14 to 33. Verses 14 to 17 introduce the three great religious festivals of ancient Israel. We've already met the Feast of Unleavened Bread or the Passover. The other two feasts reflected the farming background of the land to which God was leading his people. The Feast of the Harvest marked the end of the wheat harvest in June. Elsewhere it's called the Feast of Weeks. The Feast of Ingathering was also known as the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles. It marked the end of the grape and the olive harvest in the autumn, and indeed the Passover seemed to mark the beginning of the barley harvest. But all these feasts seem to have had a religious significance. The first two commemorated the escape from Egypt and the wilderness wanderings, and the last became a festival for the celebration of the giving of the law. However, it is the agricultural importance of the feast that had a prominence in the law given in these verses. The laws were intended to remind the people that it was the Lord who was the provider of all that they had been given. Since the gods of Canaan claimed to give fertility, this repeated reminder was essential. It is appropriate for Christians today to be reminded themselves that the Lord is the source of all that they have. And if we do not have the gods of Canaan, we can easily forget his goodness to us, especially when we live in countries where all that we need is always available at the nearest shop. The detailed regulations in verses 18 to 19 may seem rather obscure to us. However, leaven appears to have been a symbol of all evil, as we see in Matthew chapter 16 verse 6. And this would have emphasized the need for perfect offerings to be made to the Lord. Thus the Israelites would have been reminded of the need for a perfect substitute to be offered in the place of their sin, and also of their calling to be wholly dedicated to the Lord. The law given in the second part of verse 18 is understandable when we remember that a peace offering would normally be eaten on the same day it was offered. We can read about this in Leviticus chapter 7 verse 15. If the Lord's share was left to the next day, it would have become uneatable. To offer uneatable food to the Lord would have been very disrespectful. And we too need to be very careful that we do not slip into doing things that are disrespectful to him and giving less than our best. The law in the first part of verse 19 would have reminded the people that the Lord expected the best they could be, and it too applies just as much to us today. The last law is explained by the fact that the Canaanites sacrificed a kid cooked in milk, and the fields were then sprinkled with a dish to ensure their fertility. But the people of Israel were to trust in the Lord for their crops, and not to try to secure their fertility faithlessly. Our lives are to be governed by our dependence on him. We're not to do anything against God's will to try to get what we need. Salvation by grace leads to obedience to the Lord. Obedience is the evidence that salvation has been truly received. It's the evidence of grace in the heart. Thus the list of the laws of ancient Israel concludes with a reminder that only obedience to God's demands in verse 1 to 23 verse 19 would enable the people to enjoy the blessings of God upon his people. The Lord promised that he would send his angel to lead his people to victory. In the land they would enjoy the experience of life without curse, for sin removed in verse 25. And the language used at this point, the abolition of sickness and the guarantee of long life, recalls the experience of Adam and Eve in the garden before sin intervened. It also pointed forward to the final kingdom of God, of which Canaan was only ever a shadow, as we see in Revelation chapter 21, verses 3 and 4. And this explains why the Canaanites had to be wiped out from the land, as is mentioned in verses 23 and 33, and that their gods had to be removed in verses 29 and 30. There could be no place in God's kingdom for either sin or sinners. But as the sparing of Rahab was subsequently to show in Joshua chapter 6 verse 17, the extermination of the Canaanites had a religious rather than a racial motivation. Rahab had accepted the God of Israel and was therefore able to claim full membership of his people.